For as long as there have been wars, sexual violence has been used as a weapon against both women and men. The practice can destroy an enemy without killing them. It's a war crime, an effective weapon, and a taboo topic. The first male victims to demand justice in court are survivors of the Bosnian War. In conflict regions in Africa, too, survivors of sexual violence are breaking their silence. And yet perpetrators aren't being held to account. Can that change? Invading Russian forces have raped male prisoners in Ukraine. In areas recaptured by the Ukrainian army, investigators have found horrific evidence of the crime.
They raped me for 3 days. I had the feeling that everyone could tell what had happened to me.
They said, "We're going to sterilize you now."
Ukrainians Oleksiy Sivak and Roman Shapovalenko have decided to go public with their stories. That's not an easy thing to do. Men who have experienced sexual violence don't only have to deal with their trauma. They also face prejudice and a lack of understanding within their own society. The Ukrainian city of Kherson on the Dnieper River still feels like a ghost town. Russian forces withdrew in November 2022 after an 8-month occupation. Of a population of 280,000 people, around 40,000 remain. Roman Shapovalenko is one of those who have stayed in Kherson. These days, he helps his sister run a small grocery store on the outskirts of the city. Before the war, he was a taxi driver. But simple acts of resistance meant he was targeted by the Russian occupiers. He sees himself as a survivor, not a victim.
There's no reason for me to hide or feel ashamed. I'm not ashamed of anything. I believe we have to talk about it, because there are lots of people, even here in Ukraine, who don't want to know what the war is really like.
Roman Shapovalenko's friend Oleksiy Sivak was also captured by Russian military units. Oleksiy used to work as a sailor. When war broke out, he had just returned from Odessa. He couldn't flee the conflict and didn't want to. That would have meant leaving his sick relatives and his pet dogs behind. The two men still bear the scars of their imprisonment by the Russians.
It's very difficult to give this interview. I have a family. I try to think about other things. The most important things for me are my family and my wife. We've been together for 20 years. We don't have any children. Now, the goal is to have a child. Before the war, it didn't work out. And after all the torture, I don't know if it's still possible. They even said, "We're going to sterilize you now."
Their home city of Kherson was one of the first targets of the full-scale Russian invasion. There was heavy fighting in the surrounding area. Kherson is a strategically important port. It lies on the Dnieper River delta, 30 kilometers from the Black Sea. Just a few days after Russia invaded Ukraine, tanks rolled into the center of Kherson. The city fell to the occupying Russian forces with almost no resistance.
My friends and I did small things. For example, we tried to put Ukrainian flags everywhere. Of course, that annoyed the Russian soldiers.
Citizens of Kherson confronted the Russian tanks unarmed. These were spontaneous acts of civil disobedience to which the invading forces reacted with extreme severity. Russian military units roamed the city, terrorizing the population. One night, they took Roman Shapovalenko from his house.
I was just wearing shorts, a t-shirt, and slippers. In the car, they covered my eyes with tape and put something on my head. I knew where they were taking me, because I'm a local, so I knew the way. I had already heard about the place. Friends had warned me about it, saying, if you don't stop what you're doing, you'll end up in those cellars. Hardly anyone gets out of there.
Roman was arrested. Then, an hour and a half later, the Russians came for me. But Roman's arrest gave me some time. I managed to hide some things, ribbons in the Ukrainian colors and leaflets. I rushed home to warn everyone who had been in contact with me. I told them to delete everything from their cell phones and forget they ever knew me.
During the 8-month occupation, the invading forces set up 11 temporary prisons in schools, city administration buildings, and an airplane hangar. Ukrainian investigators later found abundant evidence that prisoners had been mistreated, but it was difficult to identify them. Survivors often don't come forward because under Ukrainian law, their names would be made public.
All witnesses who are registered with us and who make statements are subject to a certain procedure. We have to publish all decisions concerning the state and legal trials in the media so that they're generally accessible. In our case, that means a newspaper called The Courier and the website of Ukraine's Public Prosecutor's Office.
But Oleksiy Sivak and Roman Shapovalenko were not deterred by this. They were among the first to testify to Ukrainian authorities. Both had ended up in the same Russian prison, housed in a former Ukrainian police jail in Kherson. They were locked up in an overcrowded cell and repeatedly tortured as their captors tried to get information from them about the Ukrainian army.
One asked questions while another turned this dynamo that caused electric shocks. Two others beat me, hitting me with their fists and with a baton. At some point during the torture, in the middle or towards the end, I don't know exactly, the electric wires were attached to my genitals. I couldn't bring myself to look at the marks on my back where the electrodes were attached. To say I screamed would be an understatement. There just aren't words to describe it. They were inhuman screams.
They forced me to take off my shorts and attach the electrodes to my scrotum and penis. With others, they apparently attached the electrodes themselves. But in my case, they forced me to do it myself. Then they started to give my genitals electric shocks, while asking the same questions over and over again. They did it by turning the lever of a field telephone. There were 20 to 30 electric shocks per turn. It's like a lightning bolt in your eyes, in your head.
Investigators later found evidence that was consistent with the men's statements. There were signs of the systematic torture of prisoners, such as field telephones that provided the electricity that was then passed through their bodies.
That wasn't enough for one of them. He took a knife, stabbed me in the leg, and twisted it. Then it was over. The torturers took me to a cell and kept me there for 51 days.
The two friends were eventually released, but simply returning to normal life was impossible. Their injuries, the trauma and the shock were too severe. Where does this kind of brutal violence come from? That's a question that Regina Mühlhäuser asks in her work. The Hamburg-based historian is part of an international network that's been researching the topic of sexual violence in armed conflict since 2008. One focus of the global group, violence against men.
Overall, you can say that sexual violence against men takes place primarily in captive situations. For example, in prisons or prisoner of war camps. It's less common on the battlefield. We haven't observed as much sexualized violence against men there. Primarily what we see are acts of brutality targeting the genitals. It's intended to humiliate and degrade men and their sexuality. In that sense, the aim is really to destroy their masculinity, their maleness.
The same patterns can be seen in numerous African conflicts. This is the Ugandan capital, Kampala. The city is home to many refugees from neighboring countries, including those who have experienced sexual violence. But few feel able to talk about it. Masakolo Limba, who goes by Freddy, comes from eastern Congo and fled to Uganda in 2017. He too is a survivor of sexual violence. Despite the terrible events he's lived through, he now has some hope. In a refugee camp, he made contact with an aid organization called the Refugee Law Project, which supports traumatized people. Aid workers have accompanied him to a hospital in the nearby city of Mbarara. Deogracias Tuzuka translates his words for the Ugandan doctor.
The body is not okay. Apart from that, I have insomnia and also the back. And my testes, when it is very cold, it is painful.
Sometimes the mental consequences that they come with, they can't sleep. Some of them are depressed. You can actually assess and see this what they are presenting with is actually depression. They definitely have signs of post-traumatic stress disorder.
There's far too little medical and counseling support for the victims. Thousands of refugees are left to deal with the trauma of sexual violence on their own. Rita Atukwatse from Divine Mercy Hospital has seen some extremely serious injuries during her work.
Okay, keep raising, keep raising. They usually come with groin pain. Some of them have been castrated. Some of them come with the wounds from the assault that has happened. Some of them have come with their penises tied and Some parts have like necrotized and died off. I think, those are the ones that I've seen so far.
In eastern Congo, massacres are regularly carried out on the civilian population. The region is rich in rare natural resources. For decades, it's been fought over by government troops and militia groups as they vie for power and influence. Rebel militias in particular have been accused of mass rape, with tens of thousands of women and men experiencing sexual violence. Congo has become known as a place where rape is especially rife. Masakolo Limba's father worked for the government in his village in the remote north of the Kivu region. He was tasked with reporting rebel attacks to the Congolese military. One day in 2017, hundreds of people in the region were once again fleeing from an outbreak of violence. When the father and son traveled together to a neighboring village, they were intercepted by rebels.
We were both passengers on a motorcycle. The driver was at the front, then me, then my father. We were stopped by armed men. My father said to me, "Come, Freddy. Now you can learn something and find out how to do my job." But the rebels were watching us very closely. When the driver got off the bike, they immediately opened fire and shot him. Then they took my father and me to an unknown location.
Masakolo Limba now lives in Nakivale in Uganda. It's one of the largest refugee camps in the world. Every week, hundreds more people arrive, fleeing conflicts in different parts of Africa. The population has reached nearly 180,000. He tries to earn a bit of money by delivering water. The camp is divided into countless villages. Refugees like Masakolo and his family are allocated small pieces of land. It's been 8 years since he fell into the hands of the rebels. At the time, he was just 24 years old.
My father, they put a rope around his neck. The rebels blindfolded me. When they took my blindfold off, my father was already dead. They had hanged him. He was lying dead on the ground, and they urinated on him.
The rebel army wanted to recruit him. They threatened to harm his wife, who was back in his home village. And they had other tactics to try to get him to comply.
I had to wear a blindfold. They told me I had to stay for 3 more days because they wanted to bring me to their side, to make me stronger and turn me into a bad boy like they were. I had to stay for 3 days and 3 nights. I always had a blindfold on, so I couldn't tell day from night. Every single hour I would hear someone coming in, and then I was raped. For 3 days.
After 3 days and nights, Masakolo managed to escape. Unexpectedly, a rebel who was an old friend of his father helped him. But he could no longer go home. His village no longer existed. Like so many others, it had been burned down by the rebels. Many in the Nakivale camp have suffered a similar fate. But Masakolo has found the strength to talk about his traumatic experiences.
Sexual violence against women was long understood as a biological phenomenon. In other words, something driven by instinct, where men would follow their urges and rape women. And then women started to argue that it was actually about power, that it was political violence, and that this was what we had to come to terms with. Sexual violence against men is also a long-standing issue, but it was understood under the umbrella term of torture. It wasn't seen as sexual in that sense. And now people are saying, no, in order to really understand what's happening, you also have to understand that men really are violated in terms of their sexuality and their sexual self-determination.
In July 1995, forces of the Army of Republika Srpska, the VRS, invaded the town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia.
Conflicts in the former Yugoslavia changed the way sexual violence against men was seen. Those who experienced it were mostly Bosnian Muslim civilians, both men and boys. Much of it took place in the camps of the Bosnian Serb army. In 1993, after massive human rights violations, the UN Security Council decided to establish an International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The court was based in the Netherlands.
The lesson that we are all accountable to international law may have finally taken hold in our collective memory. This will be no victor's tribunal. The only victor that will prevail in this endeavor is the truth.
The court was the first tribunal of its kind since the Nuremberg trials that followed the Second World War. 161 people were indicted in The Hague, including presidents, generals, and politicians. No one was to be above the law. There were high hopes that the court would bring justice to the victims and punish the perpetrators. Bodo Weber has studied the work of the Yugoslavia Tribunal. It marked the first time that sexual violence against men in armed conflict was tried as a crime. The court in The Hague set the standards.
The Hague Tribunal was the first international criminal court to try to prosecute sexual violence under the banner of war crimes. Not only that, it was the first to define sexual violence not just as the action of an individual perpetrator, but also as part of a systematic policy of war crimes. And it was the first to prosecute acts of sexual violence against men, as differentiated by gender.
These efforts were closely followed in Bosnia.
First time in history was crucial moment. Historical crucial moment because it provides judges, prosecutors and judges with strong tool to determine individual responsibility for those who made that.
In The Hague, a process had been set in motion that promised positive effects, not only for Bosnia, but for the whole world. Zenica is a city with around 100,000 residents. During the Bosnian War, a large number of people fled here to escape ethnic cleansing by the Bosnian Serbs. Most were Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks. Zihnija Bašić had served as a soldier in the Bosnian army. After leaving the army, he ran a small farm. He was a civilian when he fell into the hands of the Serbian military police.
That experience was with me for a long time. It was very painful. It caused me a lot of inner struggle, especially when it came to what I went through in captivity and everything that happened in that time. Then, at an event, I met the director of an organization called Medica Zenica. She encouraged me to talk about my experiences in order to find relief and some measure of inner peace.
The director is a psychologist named Sabija Husić. She herself also fled to Zenica to escape the atrocities. That's where she first joined the aid organization Medica Zenica.
When we started to work, we did not have idea to work with men who survived sexual violence. Even in that time, men or media did not speak about that kind of trauma when we speak about men. Having in mind that we live in a very patriarchal society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, For men also, it was so hard, so difficult to start to speak up about their experiences such as sexual violence.
The crimes committed in the Bosnian Serb camps served the goal of ethnic cleansing in the areas the group controlled. More than 30,000 civilian Bosniaks were killed. The Research and Documentation Center in Sarajevo put together a dossier on every single victim. Some of the camps were large, like this one in Manjaka. But there were also hundreds of smaller ones spread across Bosnia. In December 1995, Zihnija Bašić was abducted by Serbian military police and taken to an improvised prison on the outskirts of Sarajevo.
After the arrest, they beat us and took all our clothes, literally everything. They undressed me. I was left completely naked. After the beating, I lost consciousness. Occasionally, I became conscious again. And each time I did, I felt a sharp pain in the area of my anus. I screamed in pain. In those moments, I could clearly feel a blunt object enter my body, and it was left there. It was a kind of small military spade. Moving was impossible. Every attempt to move made the pain worse and worse.
The building where he was tortured is located on a picturesque square in a middle-class neighborhood. There are restaurants and bars. But behind these walls, he was chained naked to a radiator for 3 days. He was raped several times. After he was released, he was unable to talk about what he'd been through.
The most moving moment was when my son, who was 5 or 6 years old at the time, asked me, "Dad, did they beat you? Did they beat you up?" I told him, "No, son." Then he said, "Well, even if they beat you up a bit, it doesn't matter. The main thing is that you came home." I'll remember those words forever.
Together with psychologist Sabija Husić, Zihnija Bašić has decided to return to the place where he was tortured. Even 30 years later, he still finds it difficult to stand in front of the building without feeling fear or shame. After his ordeal, he found he couldn't shake off the memories of what had happened. He developed an anxiety disorder as his traumatic experiences kept coming back to him.
As for life afterwards, it was really difficult and traumatic for a while. I had the feeling that everyone could tell what had happened to me. But time passed and life had to go on. I had to get used to this kind of life, even though my soul continued to bleed. The physical wounds may have healed, but the wound in my soul will never heal.
Disturbing details of sexual violence against men came to light in The Hague, beginning with the trial of Duško Tadić, a local Bosnian Serb politician. He was the first defendant to stand before the Yugoslavia tribunal. His crimes include torture, murder, and rape. In 1997, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The goal of such torture is to destroy the victim.
It's really sad and humiliating to talk about what I saw. Prisoners were forced to do things with each other, with their sexual organs, something a normal human being wouldn't do. What they had to do was terrible. These were innocent people, and these things happened. They were abused for no reason at all.
When used as a weapon of war, sexual violence is designed to degrade women and men, to destroy families and even entire communities.
Those societies which are oriented macho, that men are always strong, heads of families, heads in institutions and so on. They are strong. They cannot be victim of such type of crime. People cannot understand circumstances in which that happened. And particularly when we are speaking that humiliation in family environment, it is not easy for man to rape, to have sexual act with sister, with mother, but they were pushed to have that.
Conflict-related sexual abuse comes in many different forms, but the goal is always to utterly humiliate an enemy.
When victims are raped, the body is capable of being aroused. In other words, it's often the case that the victim, whether male or female, experiences a moment of physical arousal, which is extremely humiliating. That loss of control over one's own body is incredibly shameful, partly because this physical arousal is misunderstood in our society and interpreted as pleasure. Then a victim gets told that they somehow enjoyed it after all, that they wanted it, if not actively, then at least passively. So the victims essentially get accused of being partly responsible for the behavior of the perpetrators. And they also accuse themselves of that. And a related effect is that those who've gone through it suddenly accuse themselves of being homosexual.
In Uganda, being homosexual or being accused of being so is highly dangerous. One of the world's harshest laws targeting homosexuals was enacted here in 2023. They face life imprisonment or, in some cases, the death penalty. Under these circumstances, a rape survivor who speaks openly about their experience is taking a big risk. Initially, Masakolo Limba only confided in his wife.
My wife asked me what had happened to me there. I told her everything. I didn't want to hide anything from her. When I finished, she started to cry. But she comforted me, because after all, I was the one who had suffered, not her.
With the support of the Refugee Law Project, Masakolo Limba has publicly broken his silence. The organization cares for survivors of sexual violence. Men who have experienced it not only suffer from the physical effects, they also feel compelled to hide their ordeal. Group sessions with other survivors offer an important opportunity for them to talk about what they experienced.
I want all of us to sit in this manner, this way. Let's put our hands on our knees. And we need to breathe in. That may help us feel okay. Let's start. Let's go. Ni Kiingereza nye batasikia.
Simbona sasa wewe ndio una tafsiri.
Sawa.
Siku zote nikiamka mimi siko nakuwa vizuri.
So all these days when I wake up I'm not well.
Sababu nikienda kwenye kazi yangu ya saluni ninaanza kuambiwa kama mimi ni PD.
So they call me homosexual.
Sababu pana shida yenye ilinifikia mimi na kilia.
The host communities, wherever we go, when we try to tackle and to struggle for our lives, they don't want to associate with us. They even fetching water using the same tap. Even going and work with them, it is very difficult. Even approaching them, it is very difficult because they believe that we are homosexuals. Because we have already experienced bad things and we couldn't even need other more harm. Because what we have experienced, we think it is enough.
The Refugee Law Project is based in the Ugandan capital, Kampala. The new legislation makes the NGO's work extremely difficult. Some hospitals turn away survivors of sexual violence out of fear they could become targets of hostility. And many survivors don't even dare go to hospitals. The organization estimates that there are thousands of survivors in Uganda alone. And with ongoing conflicts in neighboring countries, more are arriving every day.
People were exercised basically by the community, or you can no longer be a man anymore if this is the case. So there's a stigma in discourse, the language that is used. There's a stigma around not to validate your experiences. Basically, you feel rejected. And so even a lot of these people we encountered moved away from the settlement. They are staying in the cities or in the urban centers, which is more anonymous and make it feasible for them to talk.
If the survivors are prosecuted instead of the perpetrators, the likelihood of justice being done to those committing sexual violence is virtually zero. But in places where homosexuality is stigmatized, how do the perpetrators manage to ensure that only their victims face that stigma, not themselves?
Of course, the perpetrators may also fear that they could be labeled as homosexual. But in certain contexts, that doesn't apply. For example, in the military, it's actually relatively common for soldiers to rape other soldiers. Soldaten andere Soldaten vergewaltigen.
For example, it happens in the US Marines, where it's seen as a kind of endurance test.
So eine Art Härtetest ist. Also Männer vergewaltigen andere Männer.
Men rape other men, and enduring this sexual violence is seen as evidence of a heightened capacity to cope with suffering, an expression of strength.
In 2004, these images from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq shocked the world. They showed American military personnel as torturers. The soldiers in question also used sexual violence on their victims.
That's why in this situation, it's possible to actually rape without having a stigma of homosexuality attached to it.
Another survivor who wishes to remain anonymous almost died from this type of violence. He lives near Kherson in Ukraine. As a former soldier, he attracted the attention of the occupying Russian forces.
A local who was collaborating with the Russians betrayed me and showed them where we lived. Then they took me away. The beatings began in the morning and continued all through the day and into the evening. They asked me the same questions over and over again, and when I said I didn't know anything, they just kept going. This went on every day for a week. They beat me with rifle butts and boards, suffocated me with plastic film, and used a taser on me. They wanted to burn me. They poured diesel over me. There was also sexual violence, everything you can imagine. I received a rather unpleasant injury which I'd rather not describe. But as a result of the injury, I was given a stoma, an artificial anus.
The man had to undergo several operations. He's since gone back to his old job as a farmer. He hasn't had any help to deal with what he went through.
By about the 7th or 8th day, I probably couldn't have walked anymore. I hadn't gotten up for 3 days, and they thought that was it for me. They took me out of the village and dumped me at the cemetery, thinking I was going to die. But after a while, I got up and crawled home. A month later, they came to the village and asked if I'd been buried.
War isn't an exception. We look at what was happening before a conflict began. We look at how gender relations, sexuality and violence were lived and experienced in the pre-war period, and how this was then implemented under the specific and extreme conditions of war. And if you look at the pre-war period, you realize that there were already numerous practices and situations of many different kinds involving sexual violence against men. In boarding schools, in the army, in military training, for example, as a way of consolidating the military hierarchy. We often find instances of sexual harassment, sexualized brutality, and sexual violence in these places.
Abuses committed under the Russian occupation of Ukraine are part of a culture of violence. For years, human rights activists have been drawing attention to conditions within the Russian penal system, where detainees have experienced torture and rape. This video is part of a collection smuggled out of Russian prisons. Prosecutor Anna Sosonska has studied the pattern of torture and abuse in Russian prisons, which mirrors what is being inflicted on Ukrainian prisoners.
We're investigating cases of civilians who are illegally detained by the Russian Federation, as well as Ukrainian prisoners of war. There's a clear, systematic pattern emerging, especially with regard to sexual torture. This includes things like electric shocks to the genitals, beatings targeting the genitals, and threats of castration and rape. There's a clear policy in place from the moment these detention centers are set up to the moment a Ukrainian arrives there and is subjected to torture, including sexual violence.
The images come from different Russian prisons and show scenes of sexual violence. Viewer discretion is advised. They were taken before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
There's a caste system made up of masters and subordinates. If you're a subordinate, it's like you're no longer human. They apply this prison culture in their society, then use the acquired knowledge and skills on their enemy, their opponent.
Violence is deeply rooted in Russian society and the penal system. Prisons there are a breeding ground for a culture of inhumanity. In the military, torture and sexual violence is also directed against the army's own soldiers. It's part of the norm, whether in war or peacetime.
People have to know about it. You could compare it to domestic violence. It's almost the same thing. You have to talk about it. If you don't, it'll continue and grow, like an avalanche. The scale will get bigger.
When seeking help, survivors of sexual violence face enormous challenges. Bureaucratic hurdles are often insurmountable, especially for men, who are usually left to go through the process completely alone.
At first, I thought I was the only one who couldn't find help. But I soon realized that lots of men feel the same way. Now we help each other, just like it was back in the cells. There, your fellow prisoners were the only ones you could rely on. No one treated the wounds on your back. No one helped you stand up or brought you water or food. And the only psychological support came from your cellmates.
In 2024, Oleksiy Sivak founded a network of Ukrainian men who had survived imprisonment and torture. Together, they campaign for the release of all those who are still being held in Russian prisons.
I believe that hundreds of people are currently being tortured, including sexually. For me, justice means all these people being released and returning to their families.
The men meet regularly to talk together and to learn to live with their experiences.
I don't want to see revenge and public executions in the squares of Russia. What I want is for those who tortured me to be brought to justice and sent to prison. I don't want personal revenge.
There has been abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. But according to a 2024 UN report, the extent of it is very different in Ukraine compared to Russia. So far, there's no concrete evidence of systematic abuse of Russian prisoners in Ukrainian prisons, whereas Russian authorities have systematically used sexual violence. Reports and images from the Ukraine war bring back memories for those in Bosnia.
They called me and asked, "Oh, it's so difficult to watch all that things. Everything happening like in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's important that we share our experiences and also that we learn from each other. Sexual violence is sexual violence, nevertheless, where it happened. Survivors feel with pain, with shame, most of them, nevertheless, where they are in Bosnia or Kosovo or in Yazidi community in Kurdistan and so on, they feel stigmatization from their communities.
In Bosnia, it took a long time for those affected to be recognized as victims of war.
Medica Zenica initiated the entire process. At the time, I still wasn't very mentally stable. They fought on my behalf. The process took forever, but then I was recognized as a civilian victim of the war. Our bureaucratic system is so confusing that it would have been really difficult to do on my own. It took fully 3 years. With Sabiha's help, I was able to get through it.
Few survivors in Bosnia get compensation. The promised compensation funds haven't materialized. But completing the legal process was a first step.
There's no more impunity for most of the key perpetrators. After the Yugoslavia court was wound down, war crimes tribunals were also set up in the individual countries, especially in Bosnia, where the criminal court has a war crimes division. But special prosecutors' offices and courts were also set up in Serbia to prosecute war crimes.
But efforts towards acknowledgement and compensation have stalled. War crimes such as those committed in Srebrenica are denied by Serbian nationalists, despite thousands of pages of evidence from The Hague. The situation means that sexual violence survivors, both men and women, are again being marginalized.
On the whole, and taking these various aspects into account, it's unfortunately the case that the legal and judicial process and the appraisal of millions of pieces of evidence had very little socio-political effect. In other words, the legal and judicial process achieved more within the courtroom than it did in shaping broader societal or political outcomes.
Meanwhile, war-torn countries in Africa often lack the legal mechanisms to hold perpetrators accountable. The justice system in the Democratic Republic of Congo is considered too weak. In neighboring Uganda, local authorities are unable to punish sexual violence against men due to discriminatory legislation.
I think in Uganda, most of the law books talk about rape only in relation to women. The law needs to recognize there's also male rape. But I think at the moment, you cannot rape a man, according to the law book. So the language of conversation, of discourse, needs to be broadened up. 2, humanitarian and development actors need to begin to make resources available to respond to men and boys who are victims or are survivors of sexual violence and conflict. They are real.
Survivors of sexual violence from Bosnia, Congo, and Ukraine have broken their silence for this film, despite their fear of stigmatization and discrimination. Sexual violence against men occurs almost everywhere wars are being fought. There are recent reports about the prisons of the former Syrian regime. Allegations are also being investigated from the war in Gaza that followed the October 7th attacks. There are accusations against both Hamas and Israel. Sexual violence leaves survivors with both physical and psychological injuries. But more and more of them are breaking their silence and sharing their stories.